Kemper, and I will be the moderator of this session on rules-based international order or return of geopolitics. Now, you mostly have been here for a day already, so I'd like to involve you immediately. Let's do it by a show of hands. It's a question. Who is for a rules-based international order? Please show your hands. And who believes that there is a return of geopolitics? Please show your hands. So is it sort of a 60 to 40 vote here? We will ask you the same question at the end of our discussion at 12:30. Until 12:30, we are in the hands of a very distinguished panel, and I'm extremely honored to be able to facilitate this work now. We have agreed with the speakers that they all take 5 to 6 minutes for their opening statements. Then we would like to engage them in some conversation here up on the podium. And I would really appreciate if you could also prepare 1 or 2 or 3 questions, comments, remarks to which our speakers can react. And then we're going to wrap it up with a 1-minute final statement of each of the speakers between 12:20 and 12:30. Now, you all have downloaded the app of the Bled Strategic Forum, and the app as well as the Bled Strategic Times give you a lot of information about the speakers, so I don't necessarily need to introduce them. But to my right is our first speaker, His Excellency Syed Abbas Araghchi. He's a Deputy Foreign Minister of Iran, and he actually just comes from Paris, he told me, and I'm sure he has some insight into the question how much rules are being followed and how much geopolitics is returning. And I understand that you lifted your hand when I asked about the return of geopolitics.
Oh, yes.
Did you? You just need to switch on the front. Araghchi, the floor is yours.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good morning, everybody. It's very good to be with you in such an important forum in this magnificent city, which is for me the first time. Well, it's a very important question, and the time limit is really difficult. I hope you give me some more minutes as the first victim in the in this gathering. Well, I believe that as we are entering the 2020, it is more than any time in the past obvious that the law of the strongest prevails over the strength of the law. And that was one of the questions you raised in your concept paper. I believe it is unfortunately a very naked fact that we are witnessing nowadays. And since I have very limited time available, let me to directly go to the case to tell you about the fact that I just mentioned. And the case, as you can imagine, is the nuclear deal, Iran's nuclear deal, which is known as JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. All of you know that JCPOA is the only achievement of diplomacy, at least in our region. I can mention maybe rare achievements of diplomacy in the world in the recent time, but at least in our region and in the Middle East, this is the only achievement of diplomacy. If you look at our region from Libya to Afghanistan, we have a set of all kinds of difficulties and crises. In Libya, Sudan, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, everywhere we have lots of difficulties, lots of problems. We have terrorism, we have extremism, we have war, we have civil war, we have everything. And all these problems are already in blood, unfortunately. We had only one problem, one question, which resolved through diplomacy by introducing a win-win game, and that was Iran's nuclear program. And the concerns which were raised about our nuclear program, so we decided to exercise diplomacy, to engage into negotiations and find a solution for that. And we were successful. And it is really disappointment that the United States, President Trump, is trying to destroy that very example of diplomacy, that very achievement of diplomacy in our region. And that would certainly not help the peace and security in our region. Why the United States is trying to destroy this achievement? As it is said, simply because a new president doesn't like the achievements of the previous president. There are at least 15 consecutive reports by the IAEA, which is the only judge in this game, confirming and verifying and confirming Iran's full compliance to this deal. Iran negotiated in good faith. We concluded the deal in good faith, and we implemented the deal in good faith. But that was not the case in the other side of the story. The United States decided to go out of this deal, while Iran was fully complying. Again, because a president think that the US has lost in this negotiation, and he wants to go for a better deal. All of you are familiar with a very basic principle in international law, which is pacta sunt servanda, to respect the agreements. Agreements should be kept, must be kept. This is a very simple, very basic principle in international law. But the US is just violating a very basic principle of international law. JCPOA is not an agreement between Iran and the US. It is not even an agreement between Iran and the group of countries, P5+1 or E3+3, whatever you prefer. It is, in fact, a decision by the Security Council. If you see the resolution 2231, the JCPOA is integrated to the resolution. It's a part of the body of the resolution. So the Security Council has made JCPOA as its own decision. So the resolution 2231 is perhaps the longest resolution in the history of Security Council. It is about 150 pages, because the whole JCPOA is a part of that. And by withdrawing from JCPOA, the United States is violating a Security Council resolution. And unfortunately, nobody cares. Nobody is condemning. Yes, some countries are condemning that in words, but in action. No country even dares to sanction United States because of the violation of the Security Council resolution. Imagine if Iran had done so. Huge sanctions were imposed on Iran. So the United States is very easily violates its own agreement. Just after an election. What we had in the United States was just an election, not a revolution. But even after revolutions, countries remain committed to the previous agreements. And my last point, after the US withdrawal, the other participants to the JCPOA, especially Europeans, E3 countries, Britain, Germany, and France, asked us to stay in the deal, and they promised to find practical solutions in order to let Iran still benefit from the sanctions lifting, to compensate the absence of US. But what happened? It is now 18 months, 1 year and a half is passed from the US withdrawal, and Europeans are still not able to create a simple banking channel to let business between Iran and Europe, to let their own companies do business with Iran. 18 months, and not a simple banking channel. Yes, they are working on a mechanism called Instex, but Instex is still not functional. And even it becomes functional, everybody knows that it is useless. Why? Because the US doesn't allow. Why? Because all European companies and banks have already withdrawn from Iran. Why? Because they follow instructions from US Treasury rather than instructions from their own governments. Why? Because the European economy is dollarized, and dollar is weaponized. The US is using the strength of its power, its dollar, to impose its own policies on other countries. And everybody has to follow, because there is no option. Otherwise, it would be penalized by the US. They would be punished because of the strength of dollar. So I believe that the law of strongers are now prevailing the strength of law. And this is a fact that we have to confront it. How? Maybe we need some more time to discuss about that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Minister. For this expose into the subject matter with a very specific case. And I'd like to move on to a different region, because you mentioned your region, to Africa. Mr. Badeo is actually heading the strategy consultancy in Nigeria. How do you see that question I asked at the beginning, the question for the panel, rules-based environment versus geopolitics and the return of geopolitics from where you are?
I would like to start, before coming to the topic, by expressing appreciation for the fact that Slovenia is a very small country, but one that is trying to lead the thinking in our world, that a lot is not correct about what is happening. And calling people together for the last 14 years is a significant achievement on the part of Slovenia. I'm aware of other things. Yesterday, the president mentioned the International Trust Fund, ITF, which has also been a very soft power aspect of Slovenia efforts. We in Africa were very, very much appreciative of the Tito era in terms of decolonization, but it looks like everybody from Yugoslavia disappeared totally in terms of relationship with Africa. And Slovenia is rebuilding that up, because what ITF is doing, I have benefited from listening to what they are doing with respect to the Economic Community for West Africa and also the African Union. So I want to say that that is very much appreciated before moving on to the topic. As to the topic, I would rather like to suggest that it should have been rules-based international order and or return of geopolitics. That will then give us the flexibility of accepting that there are instances of rules-based situations in our world, and there are many instances that continues to perpetuate the problem of geopolitics, where raw power is being used. And when you take them one by one, we need not go as far back as the Treaty of Westphalia and the world that it decided at that time, in which a number of Europeans got together and decided this is what the world was going to look like. Of course, Russia was there. They didn't call China, India. India was seen as a colony of United Kingdom. That was even later, but it wasn't. But let's start with just 1945, when you talk about rules-based, we are largely focusing on the reconstruction that came out of the Second World War, in which case a decision was made and led by the United States to set up a set of debates on Bretton Woods system, which puts together a number of rules that govern our economic interaction. And then we need to stop the possibility of war again. And in that respect, let's put together the United Nations. And in putting together the United Nations, it was clearly decided that 5 countries are going to have the extraordinary power that any one of them can veto whatever the rest of the almost 200 are keen about and get away with it. So if we're talking about rules-based, whose rules are we talking about? That's a starting point. Of course, many of us, especially in Africa, perhaps in Africa, there might have been, I think there was Ethiopia, Liberia, and probably apartheid South Africa. The rest of the continent of 55 countries were not part of any of these dialogue. And it's okay that you are not there at the time, but you could be part of it later if there had been the flexibility that allows the updating of those rules in such a way that you can now be making changes to say, okay, yeah, if there are 1.2 billion people in Africa and they don't have a voice that is able to aid negotiations within the rules that are set, they ought to have a seat. There's been all that discussions about reforms of the United Nations and all the rest of it and what have you. So the starting point has to be very, very clear. There are several other things that, that this throws up. What is the nature of the power relationship in the world? The Spanish foreign minister yesterday was suggesting that he sees two powers. I think it's, for me, I see more than 2 powers in our current world. I see the United States and China very clearly. Now, at the economic level, there is no doubt that in the next few years, China will, in all probability, dwarf the United States, and the reactions of the United States are becoming very, very clear in that respect. So when we are talking about rules-based, the power that was benefiting from the rules that were set up in 1945 is now the one that is very much against those rules. Look at trade. Look at the relevance of the United Nations. United Nations agreements are violated at will by the power that should be defending all that. So when you put all this into a clear perspective, you also have Europe. Even without, with Brexit, Europe will still be a very strong power to be contented with in our current world. But Europeans like to, coming out of what the Spanish foreign minister was saying, Europeans appear to me to want to witch away Russia. That's not the case. Russia is very, very clearly there at the military level. It's not only economics that makes power. That's why they took Crimea, and the rest of the world is unable to do anything about it. I will take specific questions with respect to Africa, but I thought that we should get the assumptions behind this question of the question very clear. We never left geopolitics. It has always been there. There are rules based for some people where you share values together. And it's a wrong assumption that Europeans have that the values of Europe is the values of the world. No, it is not the case. I'll give you a quick anecdote. An American went to the Pacific with some of his friends on holidays, and they saw some of the men relax and enjoying themselves by the beach, fish a little bit, eat, and then they turned around and said, look, you guys are lazy. If you could work very hard, some more fish, lobster, everything, you will make a lot of money. So what would you do with the money? You invest it. Invest in what? You buy companies. After we bought one company, what do? You buy more companies. And when you buy more companies, you restructure them, you destroy them, you make more money, you become billionaire. And then what do we do after we become billionaire? You buy your own island, and you go back and rest in your island. And they laughed. What are we doing now?
Thank you very much. And thank you very much. Thank you very much for providing a segue to our next panelist, to Jean-Christophe Belliard, who is the Deputy Secretary General of the European External Action Service in Brussels. And of course, you know, being myself a citizen of the European Union is supposed to be the most sophisticated rules-based system. And in its foreign policy, it, of course, in the Treaty in Lisbon, has stipulated a couple of aims and goals and values on which its foreign policy is based. But how do you see the situation from where you are now, also at a decisive moment, crossroad, I think it was said, for a new commission taking place, the new cycle in the EU? Jean-Christophe.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, multilateralism and rule-based, this is what the EU is. This is what defines the EU. The EU is about dialogue, about consensus, and I would say about respect. But which multilateralism are we speaking about today? We see the China way. The Chinese are trying to build, they use the word multilateralism, but this is their own multilateralism. And they are trying to build the planet B with their own principle. The USA, which we were sharing a lot, are going their way. So we have no choice at the EU to continue that path. If multilateralism fails, collapse, then the EU will collapse. The EU is linked to that concept. And so if we want to succeed, we have no choice but to defend the concept of multilateralism and rule-based order. We are pushing for an alliance for multilateralism. There are a lot of expectations that EU will be there, will be pushing. And we are not alone. We have allies in the world. We have countries on each continent that share our principles and values. We are building strong relations with sub-regional and regional organizations. The centrality of the UN, the importance of OSCE, the importance of the African Union, the importance of ASEAN in Asia, the importance of Organization of American States. So we built coalitions with others, could mention the countries of the Pacific also, and we are trying to propose a menu, an alternative, so that countries have other choice than either one big power or the other one. Coalition on a number of very important subjects. And I think the number one subject of our time is climate change and biodiversity. Defend the Paris Agreement, not just in words, but in action. And now we are making a link between the respect of the Paris Agreement and the conclusion of free trade agreements. And the last European election were a warning to us that it is becoming a very important thematic for our people. The second subject is migration. True dialogue, true respect, discuss with the countries of origin, the countries of transit. Africa will, in 2050, which is tomorrow, be 2.5 billion inhabitants. We will be 500 million inhabitants. If Africa fails, we will fail. If Africa succeeds, we will succeed. And Africa has all reasons to succeed. Creativity, youth, And I think now Europe has developed a very ambitious program. And it's not about ODA, it's about investment. Our interest is for Africa to be a success story. And this is the way we want to deal with migration. International order, rule-based, is big principles. GCPOA is one. It was the negotiations, validated by the Security Council. We must find a solution through dialogue. Two-state solution. The parameters are known. Okay, the Americans have ideas they put on the table. We will see the plan, if there is a plan. But there will be a moment where us, Europeans, together with others, Russian, Chinese, the world, will have to propose something. Two states, Jerusalem, the capital of the two states, no colonies. This is the law, the international law. I could mention Venezuela. The methodology is dialogue. That is why we have been pushing for a contact group. Korea, we are in favor. We are pushing for these negotiations. And for commerce, there are three big actors in the world today, China, USA, Europe. If the World Trade Organization is not perfect, let's reform it. Let's discuss about it. But we in the EU are against unilateral sanctions. We are against the concept of extraterritoriality. And when we speak about Iran, it is basically about that. So this is a fight that we have to pursue, and I think that is going to be one of the big ambitions of the next commission, which will start in November. So this is the way we see things from Brussels. And when I say Brussels, EU is EU, but it is also, and especially 28 member states. Thank you.
Thank you. This is an impressive list, and I'm sure it's not exhaustive of what is on there for the new Commission and the European External Action Service in the near future. It's a particular pleasure to welcome His Excellency Ambassador Shang, who is Ambassador for Public Diplomacy in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Korea. So we're moving to another region, further east. How are you seeing these developments with regard to exactly these questions, given the activities that have been unfolding to many observers' surprise in the last 2 years?
Well, good morning to everyone, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak in front of you. Well, since I'm from the region of Northeast Asia, I focus on the issue just you mentioned. But today's topic is the rules-based international order, sort of multilateralism and return of geopolitics. So I would start with saying that the UN had a very crucial role in developing gradually the multilateral system and the establishing rules-based international order. And Korea benefited from the UN's multilateralism. We have a very special relationship with the UN. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, UN forces supported South Korea, and then the reconstruction after the war was helped by the UN. And such a contribution by the UN was incremental in achieving the economic development and as well as democratization. And when we apply the perspective of multilateralism on the Korean Peninsula or Northeast Asia, many people might think of ironical situation where the economic interdependence deepens while security cooperation weakens. There are many factors for this. The low level of trust, or the complex geopolitical or historical issues, lack of dialogue. But this means that there is a lot of room for improving multilateralism in this region. Especially, multilateralism has proven to be effective on the Korean Peninsula in diffusing the increasing military tensions and confrontations. As you know, just 2 years ago, the tensions over the peninsula reaching their peak, North Korea carried out its 6th nuclear test. However, with the occasion of the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, February last year, the mood for detente and peace arose. Of course, the South Korean peace initiatives moved North Korea, but on top of that, why North Korea accepted the invitation to the negotiation table can be explained by the international, the accumulated effects of the international sanctions. And going beyond the Korean Peninsula, and our government is trying to establish Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Platform. With this initiative, relevant stakeholders in the region, including the US, China, Russia, and Japan, and Mongolia, and North Korea can promote dialogue and the cooperation on many issues of common interest. I think the countries can continue to experience this kind of regional multilateralism, and we hope that Northeast Asia can follow the Europe's precedent. And now, if I may, I'd like to, another key issue in the rules-based international order is also the free trade order. Now, just let me. Growing assertive unilateralism in some countries poses a threat to rules-based international trading system. And unfortunately, a country has taken the unilateral trade measures and intentionally to express discontent over the long-standing bilateral historical issues. And such politically motivated action can set a bad precedent, jeopardizing the multilateral trading system. And actually, this runs counter to the principle of realizing free, fair, and transparent, non-discriminatory, and predictable, stable trade environment. This principle was stipulated by the G20 Osaka leaders, the declaration. Maybe given the time limit, I will stop here, and then maybe later, at a later stage, I can come back and to speak a little bit about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Zhang, also for focusing on the trade relations as a cornerstone of the international order, something that also Jean-Christophe Béliard referred to already. It's my pleasure now to introduce Teresa Fallon. She is the director of the Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies in Belgium, in Brussels. And I ask her to maybe take up a bit the perspective as well from China, because we are going a bit from covering a couple of regions already in perspective, and I know that Teresa has been working on this file for many years. So the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's such an honor to be here. I want to thank Ambassador Miroshitz for the invitation and all the organization and hospitality shown to me. The first time I was in Bled was 26 years ago. I know, it's a long time ago. I was a graduate student at the London School of Economics. My husband-to-be took me to Italy to introduce me to his folks, and then after that stressful event, we drove from Italy to Slovenia. Back then there was no GPS, it was completely dark. And I thought, I hope this man knows what he's doing. And it was just completely dark. And he found this inn. And the next morning, he opened up the shutters. And there was Lake Bled. I couldn't believe how beautiful. So that was my memory. And to come back here now, I understand why they say Slovenia. You can't say Slovenia without saying love. So it's my first time back. So I'm really honored to be here. So what is the international order? That's what we're kind of dancing around with all these different perspectives on it. Now, a lot of people have described it in various ways, and they're very colorful, but we know it's under a great deal of stress right now. So some writers have described it as a Jenga tower. Little bits and pieces are falling off, and at one point it will fall down, or someone, Kagan, described it as going bankrupt. You go slowly, 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 and then you're completely poor. Or a crystal ball, since we're in Slovenia and they have very famous crystal. It's a crystal ball with cracks that are emerging, but those are very, very hard to repair. So what we are certain of is that we're in a period of transition and uncertainty. And anything, after 70 years gets creaky and old, and we see the international order undergoing these stresses and strains. Part of it is the rise of China. So we saw, and I know we have many Chinese in the audience here, and I had the great pleasure of living and working in China. My children speak Chinese. They do their best to do that, and my home is decorated with many Chinese things. So I have I just want to make sure that people understand that when you hear my accent, people try to figure out where you are from. And so just to lay it out on the table, my father's Irish, my mother's American, my husband's Italian, my kids grew up in Russia and China and Belgium, so you can decide which box you want to stick me in. So it's really a tale of two worlds, though. So 30 years ago, we saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, but another story happened in China, in the People's Republic of China. So we have one world, but two different systems. And this morning, when you wake up, turn on the news, what's the story? It's about Hong Kong. And this is a really key issue. We're watching, this kind of struggle. And I only have a couple minutes, so I'll stay focused. But, we're really watching quietly in some respects. I saw the EU statement. They didn't even mention, they just said, we hope both sides will cooperate. So I was in Berlin recently, and the poster that they used was something that reminded me of the Cold War. So you had Europe, like Europa, the woman, the figure that represents Europe, holding an airplane, a train, and a factory in her lap. And on the right side is the Chinese flag, and on the left side is the US flag, and they felt they were being squeezed between the two. So if you go to the Museum of Europe in Brussels, you would see these same types of posters, not with the same technology, but with the Soviet flag. So this kind of narrative of a new Cold War, but I really don't see it that way. In fact, I think that's almost lazy thinking, because we know that, we feel familiar with that, so we kind of want to fall back into old lazy tropes. So I think that we have never seen this type of challenge. It's, as the US and the Europeans have recognized, it's a systemic challenge. It's a very different system. And we thought with the fall of the Soviet Union, and this end of history, all of these battles were won. And we got very lazy about democracy and became very complacent. And I think instead of sharpening and reforming democracy, everyone's energy was kind of diffused in other ways. So we see with the admission of the People's Republic of China into the World Trade Organization, there was dramatic growth in their economy. And it's really amazing what China has done in the last decades. And I think everyone has to acknowledge that. But this idea of state-owned enterprises, the World Trade Organization, which is organized in order to help facilitate trade, there are issues because of subsidies, and there's talk of reform. But this is very, very difficult to get through. And now we also see China's investments with the Belton Road Initiative. It's very impressive, very dramatic proposal, and we also see in Central and Eastern Europe divisions because of this. So what does this mean for the future, and how will this play out? Will we see a divided Europe? How will the Belton Road Initiative really doesn't affect the US, but these are many, many questions that we need to answer. So what's happened under the Donald Trump administration? We saw previously with the Obama administration, there was a pivot to Asia, but Donald Trump is kind of more of a finger pointer, and instead of just choosing his battles carefully and maybe choosing one country to focus on, he's kind of alienated traditional allies as well as trying to shake up relations with China. So has this worked very well? Well, we saw at the recent G7, which you could say is a barometer of the Western world right now. They make up 50% of the world economy, whereas the G20 makes up, I think, 87% of the world economy. But the G7 countries are losing influence. And the fact that they couldn't even agree to make a statement is a sign that things are not working out among allies, and how to manage China. That's really one of the key questions. Okay, all right, so, I'll wind it up here. So, I'll just close with Hong Kong. It's key because the ongoing demonstrations there are a microcosm of grander political battles to come between a state of the world where people sacrifice their liberty for order and economic growth, or one that we could call an open society, open economy model. And finally, the last thing that we really haven't thought about is how this artificial intelligence or authoritarian surveillance system and social credit system. Last week we had the European Chamber of Commerce published a report how social credit, which we all think, well, that we don't have to worry about that, that's in China, but it will affect European companies as well as other companies. So this is a form of leverage that we've never seen used before, and how will this affect the relations? So a lot of these issues are putting stress on the international order. And Europe has an important role to play. I would say that they choose to kind of fence it. We see Angela Merkel at the height of the protests in Hong Kong, strains in the South China Sea, one of the hot points in the world right now, one of the important trade choke points. She's going to Beijing on September 5th and 7th. So this idea of solidarity within the EU is something I think we all hope for, and that multilateralism will win out, because at this point, the world is very unclear, and the international order is under great strain. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Bringing this sort of historical perspective of the last 30 years, and this last 30 years that you didn't spend in Bled, but maybe the next couple of years you spend more time in Bled looking at these questions. It brings me to Walter Kemp. He's actually head of strategic and planning, head of the Strategic and Planning Unit at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It was mentioned in the previous panel. One of the regional actors that also was mentioned by you. Of course, as you know, the OSCE brings together a broad variety of European and Northern Hemisphere states, including the US, Canada, and Russia. And I understand you're from Canada. So obviously, many people placed a lot of trust in Canada in the last couple of years with regard to maintaining and developing the international order. But I know you're here not as Canadian, but as planner for the OSCE. How's the OSCE seeing it?
Thanks very much. First, I'd like to say that I will be brief, partly because a lot of things that I wanted to say I wrote in an article for the Bled Strategic Review. And secondly, I'm losing my voice, so I have to be brief. But just to say, I was here also once before in 2005 during Slovenia's chairmanship of the OSCE. I understand that this conference was partly a spin-off of that chairmanship, a follow-up, so it's good to be back and see what has happened after that chairmanship. I wanted to explain why I put up my hand twice when you asked the question about, do I believe in a rules-based international order or the return of geopolitics? And I would argue that we need a return of the rules-based international order precisely because of the return of geopolitics. And if you look back in history, you were alluding to this, Treaty of Westphalia, the Congress of Vienna, the Treaty of Versailles, United Nations, those were not times when people sat together and thought about a values-based system or some kind of liberal order. Those orders were created after wars in order to prevent future wars. And what concerns me is that it shouldn't take another war 70 years after the creation of the United Nations to wake us up and think that we have to have order. Because in a nuclear age, who knows what would be left to put back together. And I think it's sobering to remember that it was almost exactly 75 years ago in the autumn of 1944. It was China, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union that came together in Dumbarton Oaks to prepare the way for what would happen after the Second World War. So again, it's not some kind of fuzzy liberal order made up by philosophers. It was people, hard-nosed practitioners, that were trying to prevent war. And the article that I wrote is trying to make the case that a rules-based international order is actually realpolitik. That these orders develop because otherwise we're going to have a system which is nasty, brutish, and short, all against all, and therefore it's actually in your national self-interest to have some kind of ordered system, some degree of predictability, some way to manage relations. The other thing that I want to pick up on is the idea of geopolitics, as if that means the mightiest only operating in the system. There are now quite a few popular books on the theme of geopolitics, and in one of them, Robert Kaplan says in The Revenge of Geography that geopolitics is the study of looking at the outside environment when you take into consideration your foreign policy considerations. The goal being, again, to achieve a balance of power vis-a-vis the interests of other states. The critique of liberal orders is that they didn't look at the world that way. When you go back and read the Charter of Paris from 1990, it's almost like Francis Fukuyama's End of History. All of the divisions of the past have ended. We won't have any problems with our historical grievances, etc. Remember the book that the world is flat. So I think there was this wishful thinking, if not naivete, in the early 1990s that we were moving away from geopolitics, but it never went away. But again, the critique was that people weren't taking into account the considerations of others. But are our current leaders really doing much better? It seems that they make their calculations as if the other side was some kind of two-dimensional actor of which you would simply bounce off of your foreign policies, and not that they would react the same way that you do. So I would argue that it's not in your national self-interest to only maximize your power as if nobody else was going to respond. And there's a great quote by the Italian president Sergio Mattarelli, who clearly knows something about cooperation at the moment. He says, "The alternative to multilateralism is only unilateralism. And a world dominated by unilateralism is a world without friends." Now, I would argue there's something in between, which is bilateralism. But even there, you see a lot of leaders who are acting as if there's a one-off transaction. And I think because of the short election cycles and even shorter news cycles, people think we'll get a deal and that's sufficient, that's a victory. But that's not how international relations works, especially with a neighboring country. If you, I won't use a rude word, but if you somehow beggar your neighbor, they're going to do the same back to you when they get the chance again, perhaps twice as hard. And you get into a tit-for-tat relationship which goes into a spiraling circle of mistrust. And again, this is particularly a problem with neighboring states. So I would argue that what we need is actually more geopolitics, more sensitivity to why other countries have their own national interests and the way that they might respond. I would argue that we need a rules-based international order. Again, not necessarily using the word liberal. These orders were created for the sake of realpolitik. And my final point would be a challenge to us all to think of a better word than multilateralism, which I think has 7 syllables. Find a word that can better explain to people the self-interest in cooperation.
Thank you very much, Walter. This is your challenge, to think about a better word than multilateralism. Itzhak, thank you for hosting us once again, and also thank you for putting together this panel, and again for putting us here in this environment of Bled. It was you probably, together with your colleagues, who came up with this session title. What was the thinking in the Foreign Ministry of Slovenia, of which you are part for many years, and where you are actually an ambassador at large and special envoy of the minister? What was your thinking behind putting up this panel? You need the microphone, even though you're at...
It's on, no?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, well, first, it's very difficult to say something new after all these interventions, but I would say that what was thinking behind was how to preserve European way of life in new international relations. If we really want to preserve European way of life, and we can pretend that there is no return of geopolitics, but the daily life shows us that it's not the case. So we have to prepare. And we have to prepare as Slovenia, but more important is what we will do inside the European Union. And Mr. Billard already talked about it. Let's face, we have a sort of competition of values in the world right now, and we have a completely new element of the geopolitics in the 21st century, and this is the technology, digital technology advancement, which is completely new, I would say, element. Disruptive technologies are completely new, and they affect differently on the multilateral system, global multilateral system, and geopolitics, which means that I said that in this opposition of values between, let's say, authoritarian systems in the world and liberal democratic system in the world, there is a big danger that we will face a split of the world in half, in the internet, on the east and western side, and on the supply chains of the world. And this is the real danger that European Union probably should step in, since we are moving not from the unipolar world after the, let's say, after the fall of the Berlin Wall to the multipolar world, but probably we are talking right now about the, of a bipolar world between China and US. And the thinking, as I said, was in this row between China and US, where is the European Union? How European Union, of course, it's clear interest of the European Union that multilateral system would serve as the best. But I think that European Union should strengthen itself, should make all the problems that it faces right now, from migration to the system of decision-making, effectiveness inside the European Union, should really, with the new Commission, put on the table. Otherwise, we are risking the European way of life, which is the preservation of the individual rights of the individual person. I think Teresa Fallon previously talked about the surveillance capitalism that is going around. And do not forget, we share the same values with the United States. Transatlantic relations are different. They will have to be changed probably inside NATO and bilaterally in the European-American relations, but in the row of values, we are on the same side, let's say. We share that. We respect individual human rights of individuals, liberties, freedom, while on the other side, authoritarian side, we cannot say that one. So, but the problem is that authoritarian side in the world, in the modern world, better uses the technologies, or the efficiency of the decision-making of the authoritarian side is higher than probably in a democratic state. So, final thinking is how to speed up or boost the effectiveness of the European Union in the global community. I don't believe that the European Union, because we have a lot of talks whether the European Union should join the race in the geopolitical race in the world, or should it go just for the multilateralism. I think that we have to strive for the multilateralism, but at the same time, I think the soft power of the European Union will not be enough in the future. So probably the European Union will have to develop sort of hard power. And here Brexit comes into play, and Brexit is not good for the geopolitical, let's say, role of the European Union on a global, since Britain is important, diplomatic and military important country. So probably at the end of the day, we will have to tackle also the decision-making process inside the European Union. It's obvious because future President of the European Commission, when she presented herself in the European Parliament, she said that one of her first tasks will be the revision of the decision-making process inside the European Union to overcome the consensus in the foreign policy for the majority voting. This will be a very difficult topic inside the European Union, but probably if you would like to preserve European way of life, the efficiency of the European Union will have to be boosted, and probably we will have to come from the, let's say, common foreign security policy to a single foreign security policy of the European Union, if European Union will continue to play at least normative trendsetter in the global community, like with the GDPR in the protection of personal data in digital era. So I think that this was the reasoning behind why we put this topic on the list of this panel.
Thank you very much for showing us a bit the way of the thinking within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Slovenia. Now, I'm working for the Council of Europe, which is also celebrating its 70 years. And of course, we share very much the idea of realizing fundamental rights and freedoms and promoting genuine democracy. And that gives me, of course, particular pleasure to welcome the Political Director of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the United Kingdom, Richard Moore. The UK being a founder of the Council of Europe, of course, and a promoter of fundamental rights and freedoms and democracy worldwide, but at the same time being engaged in probably one of the more complicated negotiations about Britain's role in the international system, whereby you would leave the European Union. And of course, is that a vote on rules-based or geopolitics? Right. How should we interpret it in this kind of dichotomy, the choice of Britain?
Thank you very much. One of my fellow panelists said you must be really relieved to come onto a panel and not have to talk about Brexit. And the chair has seen that off, hasn't he? So let me come back to Brexit. First of all, let me say what a delight it is to be in Slovenia. It's just astonishing. I didn't wake up to it in quite such a romantic way, but such a lovely place, and it's a great joy to climb up to the castle. So I think Slovenia definitely becomes the definition, I think, of a source of stability. Multilateralism and the hatred of the word, I agree, but the answer surely must not be rules-based international order, which is a crime of humanity against the English language. But it is kind of what we're stuck with, so never mind. If you look at the question that's posed for us, it's one of those things you often get, I think, at these wonderful sort of events. It's not a real question because, of course, we have had various attempts, particularly in a European arena, and we're right that we should be reminded, Treaty of Westphalia, Congress of Vienna, etc. But, of course, geopolitics didn't go away, and it hasn't gone away since 1945, and it won't ever go away, I think, while we remain human and compete as humans. But if we look back at the system that the UK helped to create with the United States in 1945, I think it has served us well. I think it was imperfect, but it has helped, broadly speaking, to keep the peace, certainly in terms of a superpower conflict through the years of the Cold War. It constrained geopolitics, if you like, without ever ending them. It was a source of stability in a very dangerous world. But in 2019, it has to be right that institutions which were set up in 1945 evolve. And I think as powers rise in this 21st century, we've mentioned China, I'm thinking of India, but also, you know, giants of Africa like Nigeria and other countries, they have a perfect right to demand more from the international order than they have hitherto got. And it is a bit creaky. So that's why, certainly in my country, we are very privileged to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council, but we're also very committed to its reform. And we recognize that it has to broaden out and has to be reformed. It is, of course, an extraordinarily difficult issue because those who would like to join it can't agree amongst themselves who they should be, and that remains a really intractable issue. But it clearly must be right that we continue to do it. We are huge supporters of what the UN Secretary General is trying to do to reform the institution of the United Nations. And if we don't manage to accommodate those rising powers in our international system, then the talk of the Thucydides trap that people refer to, of how do you manage the rise of new countries in a peaceful way without finding we need a large-scale war to refashion the international system, becomes a reality. And we must, certainly I speak as a diplomat, try to prevent that at all costs. But for me, we've got to maintain, we do have to maintain a liberal international order. We do have to try and stick up the UK for free trade in a world where tariffs are increasingly being used. We have to stick up for human rights, which are universal, and we must be very careful of those of us who tell us that they're European. They're not. Ask a Hong Konger, ask a Sudanese. These are universal rights that all human beings strive for. Rule of law, freedom of navigation, and I might come back to that. And we're going to have to compete for those, because if we are complacent, others who do not share democratic values will displace us. So we have to fight for them, I think. Not literally, but we do have to fight metaphorically. There are some countries who are pushing forward that rights should all be about development rights. They shouldn't be about human rights. We have to resist that. Of course, the development is extraordinarily important. Of course, the most fantastic achievement of China is to bring literally billions of people out of poverty, and that should be applauded and celebrated. But it's not enough. People want more. We were talking about my Iranian colleague Abbas was talking about the JCPOA, and he's absolutely right that this is an example of an international agreement. Britain signed it along with a number of others, and we're determined to uphold it. It's really important to us that we do that, and that is very much part of the international order. But we can't be over-selective about that. So, Iran also, I would say, on freedom of navigation, on what it's doing in Syria, on its arrests of dual nationals, is clearly not behaving in that way. So you can't pick and choose. We have to, I think, try a bit harder on those types of issues. Brexit. So my opening line here was sort of, which is an old cliche, I was saying, we're not leaving Europe. And I suddenly realized that I don't want you to interpret that as meaning that I know what's going to happen in the House of Commons today. I am stating a geographical fact. We are not leaving Europe. We cannot. We are not about to, although I do have to say, some of my European friends and colleagues do sometimes give me the impression that we are going to up anchor and move over to the United States. This is going to be the most fantastic. I know our Prime Minister is very keen on interesting infrastructure projects, but that feels to me to be one too far even for Boris Johnson. So we are intimately tied into Europe, and we will remain so, in security and defence and prosperity and all of those things. We clearly are leaving the EU, that is a fact, but we will want the closest possible relationship. And leaving Brexit does not mean that the UK is becoming any less committed to multilateralism. Absolutely not. I've mentioned P5. We're members of G20, G7, Council of Europe, as you mentioned at the beginning, NATO. The Commonwealth is a really important construct for us. We're a trading nation. We are a middle-ranking nation off the coast of Europe. We have historically relied on free trade and freedom of navigation. We are going to continue very much beyond that. And also, finally, it's also what our people want. We are the only country of the G20 that spends 2% of our wealth on defence. I say that advisedly in Slovenia. 2% of our wealth on defence, and we spend 0.7% of our wealth on development aid. No other country in the G20 does that. That is integral to the British sense of themselves, and it will continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, First of all, I'd like to congratulate our panelists for the extreme discipline, because you really managed the 5 to 7 minute bracket all perfectly well, which allows us to engage with you. If panelists don't have an urge to react to something that has been said now, I would open the floor for the audience for questions and remarks. I hope that there are some colleagues who have a microphone. Yes. So maybe you can come here, because then we can see who wants to take the floor. I'll collect a couple of those questions and remarks, and then we will have a last concluding round here at the panel. If I can invite you to just briefly introduce yourself so that we know who is speaking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, moderator. My name is Yoshida, Japanese ambassador to the Republic of Slovenia. I'm very delighted to have the African participant in this panel. And we recently organized the Tokyo Development Conference of Africa in Yokohama, the participation in Nigeria. Even through development process, which we organize, just the multilateralism is very important. From this Yokohama conference, we set up an action plan together with World Bank groups as well as United Nations groups. So I think that's and then I'm very happy here in Europe. Also, this panel will be consisting of wide variety of areas, including Asia and Africa. So I congratulate the success of this panel. And then touch upon these rules, I just want to touch upon this. In any case, there's some disputes or there are difference of opinion that should be settled down through diplomatic channel. And then that's also including any kind of historical or trade issues. But anyway, the government of Japan strongly oppose any kind of discriminatory measures against any country. So through that system, we set up very friendly corporate relationship with Asian as well as other regions country. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your comment. Are there further comments and questions to the panelists? Don't be shy. In the middle. Sorry, the gentleman in the third row.
Thank you. Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Charles Powell. I'm the director of the Elcano Royal Institute, which is Spain's leading international relations think tank in Madrid, Spain. Let me thank all the analysts for their very interesting observations. One of the, I'm not a China expert, and this is really why I would like to ask you for your opinion. One of the things that baffles me is how exactly should we interpret China's attitudes towards the so-called liberal international order? And I say so-called because I would rather like Joseph Nye when he reminds us that Voltaire once in the 18th century used to talk about the Holy Roman Empire, saying that it's not really very holy, it's not Roman, and it's not much of an empire. Well, you know, to some extent, I think there are a lot of people today who feel, well, you know, this ILO, the International Liberal Order, it's not really all that international, it's not terribly liberal, and it's certainly not terribly orderly. But anyway, leaving that aside, the External Action Service representative mentioned the EU's position. I think we were all very struck by the fact that back in March 2019, the European Commission for the first time described China as a systemic rival. Now, this is very tough language coming from the normally rather polite, if not taciturn, European Commission. So my question is, do we really think that China is engaging in creating an alternative, parallel, global order? And what do we base our evidence on? Is the Belton Road Initiative really enough? Is the Infrastructure and Investment Bank really the embryo of an alternative international order? And who is doing more to prevent the reform of WTO, the United States or China? Thank you very much.
For a question, is more space? I encourage also the lady behind in white, and then the gentleman in the third row as well.
My name is Saskia Harkema. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm a professor and human rights activist. And look at us sitting here. I think our generation created this mess. So where is the youth? Because we talk about youth, that we have to secure their future, secure their prosperity. And I don't see them here sitting in the panel. and I think they should sit here in the panel, because they have to have a voice to how we should move forward. And I would like you to comment on that.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman here, and then...
Hello. Yeah, thanks. My name is Yuan Han. I'm from Sichuan University, Associate Professor in International Relations. I have a short comment and one question.
Okay.
A short comment is that look at the VIPs on the stage, and there, if there's more speakers there, for example, from China, then the representativeness of this dialogue could be better, I think. Okay, improved. And my question is, when we're talking about the rule-based international order, I mean, some people like me probably think this question from purely academic perspective, that is, what are the rules? Who define the rules, and who decides the rules? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment and question. There's another one here at the...
Yes. Florent Massiac, also French Center for Rapprochement in Europe. A question, so geopolitics about geography, it's also about technology. Technology can change geography, and the assumption would be that technology can fuel this return also of geopolitics. My question is, how does it intersect with this rule-based international order? Is it easier in a world which changes technologically very fast to build such an order? So what kind of impact can I have on that? Thank you.
Okay, and then this is now your last chance for a comment or question. I'll do this like an auction. 3, 2, okay. The last one is there at the window.
Hi, my name is Anna Stothard from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the UK. Just to follow on from the point made by my colleague over here about future generations, I was wondering if you could comment on climate change's role in foreign policy today and how that fits in with the rules-based international system.
Excellent, thank you very much. I agreed with the speakers that we go in reverse order. With 1 minute concluding statements. So we have 16 minutes left, so it should work out if everyone is between 1 and 1.5 minutes, and then we wrap it up. So, Richard.
Okay, let me go very quickly. It's lovely, Charles, to hear the name Joe Nye in here. I was a teaching assistant of Joe Nye many, many years ago when I would have been able to sit respectably on this panel as a young person. Look, I think the point about the young people is really valid. And if you think about these big issues, and you think about climate change, you know, most of us are not going to be around. It's very much that. And if you talk to my daughter, you know, she's passionate about this in a way that makes me think up, sit up and think. And I just reflect on a number of these things. We talked about rise of China and others, and again, it would be, I'm sure, it would definitely add something if we were able to get Chinese participants on panels here. Look, I think the reason for hope for me is that China's done very well out of the post-war system. You know, and that sometimes reflects an attitude, for example, to reform of the UN Security Council. So they've done quite well out of it. So that's good. They have a big stake in the system. They will obviously want to change things. And all I'm saying on that, and they may well be right on certain things, and we should acknowledge that, but we need to push back if we want to defend our values. And finally, on the climate change thing, all that other stuff we talked about on rule of law and freedom of navigation and all the disputes that we can list, all of that just becomes irrelevant if we as an international community cannot use the tools of multilateralism to reach sufficient agreement to save our planet. And my own country is trying to do its best by going zero carbon by 2050. There are many I know who would argue it's not enough, but I tell you, we're the only ones doing it so far. And we want to push to, in terms of major economies, and we want to push to host COP26 in 2022 because it's really important that we grip this issue.
Thank you. There were probably questions to the organizer here, hidden in the set of questions. It's
Well, I think the Chinese colleagues were invited, but Chinese colleagues were invited to participate also on this planet, but obviously they have more important things do. Regarding China and parallel multilateral system, I think Mr. Moore said that you have to include into the creating of the global rules all the potential newcomers on the global scale that this world order would suit all of them. And for a particular, I remember when I used to be ambassador in London, that was a big debate already at that time in UK, how to incorporate China, obviously rising China at that time, into the several multilateral institutions. And from some of them, China was excluded. And the consequence of that was that China started to build up a parallel multilateral system. Just remember the infrastructural and development Asian Infrastructural Bank and Asian Development Bank, where some EU countries took part wisely, some of them on the suggestion upon US did not. But if you do not incorporate rising power, then probably you will be faced with the creation of the parallel system. At the end of the day, this would lead into geopolitical race, which we are facing right now, and we all try to escape. And I think that China, we would pretend if we would say that China is without strategy, and at the end of the day, the aim of strategy is also to change the global rules that would suit the values not of the Western part, but let's say of the eastern part of, or to say Chinese part of the world. And that is seen also in the regional instruments, multilateral instruments in Asia, particularly when US pulled out from the several free trade agreements. Regarding the technology, I mentioned that technology is a completely new factor that influences a geopolitical race and obviously multilateral system, because technology rendered possible a new, let's say, space race, which is not regulated by multilateral instruments. We have an outer space convention from the '68, which says basically that space is ownership of the humankind. But nowadays you have already interpretation that this might suits to the private companies that will enter into it. And we do not have a multilateral initiative right now that would be, let's say, of serious possibility in the frame of the UN or other multilateral fora. So we have a Wild West. For example, that was a consequence of the technological advancement in the geopolitical world, with the direct effects on the multilateral system.
I will remind you that a minute is a minute.
I would just add to that maybe digital platforms are already more powerful than some states, which means that the geopolitical race is also between digital platforms that are used by some states as well.
Thank you very much for a very important topic, obviously, but probably larger than today's panel. Walter.
Two general remarks, one on security conferences like this. I think, having been to some in Moscow and some in Western Europe, we have to be careful that we don't sit in little echo chambers and just reinforce the prevailing wisdom that it's important to talk to each other, not only about each other, whether it's to do with European security or relations with the West and China. But I have to say, of the ones that I've been to recently, this is one of the better ones in terms of having a diversity of views. And finally, just to echo Richard's point, the geo in geopolitics should be about the Earth. And I think that all of the other conflicts that we're looking at are, as you said, going to become irrelevant if we can't preserve the planet, can't have sustainable development. So I think the discussion on implementation of the Paris Agreement on the SDGs is a good way to find an agenda where countries can pull together on some pretty basic ways of behaving, which would promote a much more cooperative approach to security and development.
Thank you. Reza.
Okay.
A couple of issues.
I think the best strategy that the Chinese ever devised was to convince everybody that they had no strategy. And the Chinese always tell everyone, we're just here for business. And then all of a sudden, you go to conferences and they said, whether you like it or not, we're a power in Europe. An accidental power, but we're a power nevertheless. So how did they get there? It's incredible. So they have no strategy, but they've accomplished so much. And they are a country that has 5-year plans. So if you were at the Munich Security Conference, Fu Ying spoke and said, she had her prepared remarks, but if you listened to her before she spoke, it wasn't written down, she turned to the audience and she said, there's no such thing as universal values. They're American values. And I see all of you nodding your head in the audience and you agree with me. So I find this incredible. And we know from the leaked document 8 that the Chinese Communist Party is fearful of this idea of universal values, and they really push back against that. If we value this, we should really make an effort, because this is under stress. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of Donald Trump, but you have to give credit where credit is due. He has pointed a finger at Xinjiang. Where's Europe? They're very quiet on that. So I think we all said never again, after World War II, but we're seeing some horrible things going on in different parts of the world, which I think if we really care about universal human rights, we should make a strong statement. Who wrote the international rules? We have the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. 1983, it was drafted. The People's Republic of China sat at that table and drafted that document. 93% of world trade is done by sea. There was an arbitral tribunal decision handed down July 2016. China has ignored it. The EU didn't give a strong statement. They were considered neutral. So in terms of multilateral system, I see the EU failed. So if you have international norms and rules and you want to support them, why was the EU missing in action? It's the most important thing, the use of the seas. And if we don't support that, we're really, really in trouble. So just to conclude, the challenge is to set up a line of defense. China is there, we can't ignore it. We need to come up with a good strategy. You talked about WTO reform. China wants to, they're self-described as a developing economy. I mean, they have space stations. So I'm sorry, but they're exploiting the system. And I think this is abusive for other countries. And finally, as Lake Blood is filled with many people on honeymoon, I want to close with a quote from John Eichenberry: "To bet on the future of the global liberal order is a little bit like a second marriage, a triumph of hope over experience."
And that Ambassador Shang, dispute settlement.
Well, I'm very happy to represent the region I belong to, and well, the dispute should be solved through the dialogue and diplomatic solution. And I'm sure that in spite of growing nationalist tendency and protectionism, multilateralism, or rules-based international order is still necessary and effective. And Mr. Kemp said the UN was created to prevent the war after the Second World War. And well, that's true. I totally agree with that. I would like to quote the second Secretary General of the UN, Dag Hammarskjöld. He said the UN was not created to take the mankind to heaven, but save the humanity from hell. So we still try to prevent the war, and at the same time, we should do more to recover recover and improve multilateralism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jean-Christophe Belliard, where's Europe in this imbroglio?
I answer the specific question on China and the Commission qualifying China as a systemic rival. There are many things that we share with China: climate change, Iran, Palestine, and so on and so forth. Chinese are telling us a win-win situation in the field of commerce. We want to win one time. It's not 2 times China winning. Win-win means each of us can win. We are now discussing with China on investment code. we have a working group on the reform of World Trade Organization and on geographical indication. We want reciprocity. The EU Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai is telling us it is becoming more and more difficult to do business in China. We want to do business in China. China wants to access our markets. We want to access their markets. It is as simple as that. The difference we have with the USA is our way of trying to solve the problem. We do it through dialogue. It's complex, but I think the end of naivety it's over for us. We want reciprocity. And this is where we stand now with China. I think this commission paper was a type of wake-up call. We look at the facts. It's not about ideology, but this is where we are and where we stand. Having said that, on Iran, on many subjects, we sit down. And the Paris Agreement would not have been possible without the position of China. At the same time, the Belt and Road thing in the past, the Silk Road, was not a Chinese project. It was a joint venture between Venice, Portugal, and China. And we want the same. We have our own strategy. And we don't want to be absorbed in the Belt and Road strategy. We want to propose a menu to the world, projects that we can finance with no debt, greens, the modalities of the contract, the respect of the rights of the workers, these type of things. We don't ask countries to choose. We want to propose an alternative, a menu. So we work, but we have our own way of doing it, but we are not part of this project.
Thank you, Dr. Badeo. You've been patient now.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to reiterate the fact that there has been so much commentary about, very frankly too, defense of our values, which has resonated in much of the dialogue, but we need to always bear it in mind, the question of whose values. Of course, European values are not the values of the world. The values, we share some together, and in some we are very much apart, and that should be borne in mind constantly when Europe and America are trying to tell Africa about China in the China-phobia that is appearing on the table in the world arena, that we need to restructure the international system as best as possible. The question that was asked was very interesting, whether Belt and Road Initiative and the alternative possibility to the World Bank, when you make it impossible to make changes with respect to the World Bank, the IMF, and all those Bretton Woods institutions, it is, you have to be an American to be the president of the World Bank. You have to be a European, preferably from France, to be in the IMF. You are the best African? No, forget it. It's not for you. And then you expect that that will continue for eternity. Of course, maybe by the time China is celebrating its 100th year, it might have an alternative if we don't seek to reform what we have presently, and they probably would be much more followed by other people in Asia, Africa, Latin America, who are locked out of the present situation as at now. So we might use the 75th anniversary of the United Nations to engage in serious convention that leads to on how to go beyond forcing the Secretary General to course as reform. It's more than that. I will stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Minister, you opened this panel with a critique, and you concluded with your observations to the questions.
Thank you so much. Well, in 1 or 2 minutes, having listened to the European colleagues who spoke today, I'm now more convinced that international rules-based international order is undermining and weakening day after day. Just look at what was, our colleague from the European Union said that if multilateralism fails, EU also fails. But look at the priorities which was mentioned. All of them are actually ruined by US unilateralism. Look at the climate change as the first priority and Paris Agreement. US is out. You know the US policy about that. Look at the question of migration. He mentioned Africa, but I want him to pay attention to the Middle East. The next waves of migration might be ahead of us if JCPOA is totally failed. So this is a very important, I think more important than China, which is the most attractive question today. And I am even more surprised by what Richard said and his concept of pick and choose, that we cannot pick and choose in international order. This is exactly the return of geopolitics. This is exactly tit for tat policy. I don't respect my agreement because I don't like your policy in a certain country. I don't respect what I have agreed with you because you have arrested one of my citizens. But this is exactly tit for tat policy. This is the return of geopolitics. This is undermining international order. Iran has proved its good faith in the JCPOA, in the negotiation and in the implementation. What was the result? Reimposition of sanctions, maximum pressure policy. This is the policy of the United States against Iran. Why? Because we negotiated, because we engaged, because we implemented our commitments in full. So sanctions are back, and certain countries help zero oil policy for Iran. They stop our tankers in order to help the American maximum pressure policy. And they cannot claim why you have stopped our tanker when it violates navigation rules and regulations in the Persian Gulf. So if that is the case, this is tit for tat policy. This is against international order, rule-based international order. So this is my point, and I hope that we can consider this.
This concludes a very dense panel on rules-based international order or the return of geopolitics. I think Walter Kemp made a good comment while he raised his hand for both aspects of this question. The question remains open. The issues remain interconnected. I think we have a couple of things we can take for our further work and discussion to develop this world together. And if I may make a little suggestion to replace multilateralism at least with an ambitious, shorter word, then this obviously should be something like peace. That should be the aim of this endeavor. With this, I have the pleasure to thank all the panelists. I won't name them again because they're 8, but please join me in a round of applause for their discipline and contribution.
Thank you so much.